Dear colleagues, welcome to the last part of our conference. As you know, the topic of this part is peripheral spaces, socio-economic factors driving antisemitism. We have, as you see, here sitting 3 participants instead of 4, but you mustn't be afraid. We will have the pleasure to listen also to the lecture of Mrs. Irina Marin, who unfortunately was not able to come personally to Vienna, but we are in the lucky situation that Daniel Brett brought her PowerPoint presentation to Vienna, so we will have possibility to know also about the contents of her speech. I won't be reading this biographies because everybody can read it himself. I just mention that the first speaker, Anders Blomqvist, from the Södertörn University in Stockholm, is where he is doing his research work, but he's as well teaching Hungarian history at the Uppsala University. He's author of different studies and books. I might mention just the one, Economic Nationalism in the Ethnic Borderland of Hungary and Romania. And now the problem with pronouncing, because you are speaking perfectly Hungarian, as I've been told, antisemitism and nationalizing in the Hungarian-Romanian borderlands will be the topic of his speech, specializing on the case of Szatmár, thank you, Szatmár Satu-Mare, 1867 to 1944. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I would like to thank the organizer, but also everyone here now for contributing with interesting presentation and talks. I especially appreciate the tone and atmosphere so far we had. I will show you some map in order to orientate ourselves. This is nationalities map we were seeing just in the earlier presentation, and you can see the city of Szatmár in the borderlands between the Hungarian and Romanian dominations. I will follow this city into the interwar period, renamed under the name Satu-Mare, and then back again into Hungary during the Second World War, renamed again as Szatmár-Németi. So here we have the borders of dualist Hungary and interwar Romania. And here is the Second World War, showing the locality. So, as this is a very long time period, I will focus mainly on the anti-Semitism in dualist Hungary, when Jews were instruments of Magyarization, and I will connect it to this locality. For the later 2 periods, the interwar Romania and the Second World War Hungary, I will make some I will draw some conclusions from my studies, but I will not elaborate too much on that with details. Antisemitism in the Hungarian-Romanian ethnic borderland was marked by the Jewish position in the nationalizing processes between minorities and majorities. Jews were instrumentalized as agents of Magyarization during the dualist period, and in return they were emancipated. Jews intermingled as Magyars through linguistic and cultural assimilation, as most of them declared themselves as having Hungarian as their preferred language in the census. Many Jews received high political and economic positions within the society as Magyars on individual basis. There was no legal discrimination against Jews in dualist Hungary. Still, anti-Semitism was visible and articulated explicitly and implicitly embedded in society. One example of this implicit or structural side was Jews were underrepresented in the public sector, a sector dominated by Hungarians, which then, of course, made Jews overrepresented in free professions and in the private sector, especially within the banking and the trading sector. Gustav Békés, who was a leading political advisor and author of books on the struggle between races in Hungary and Europe, regarded the role of Jews as instrumental not only in Magyarizing commerce and industry, but also in solving the question of the nationalities. Jews played a significant role in commerce and were quickly Magyarizing according to Békés. If Jews and the economic sectors were Magyarized, this would compel the nationalities to follow, he argued. János Márk, the Romanian Greek Catholic dean, this is his Magyarized name, from Szatmár County, agreed that Magyarizing was indeed the most influential political trend of this time. However, he viewed Jewish progress as a threat to Hungarian-Romanian relations. He claimed that Jews, who were taking over politically and economically, had ruined the Hungarians. He argued that Magyarizing in reality was promoting the economic interest of the Jews and claimed that in 30 years, the Jews will be the masters in the counties and they will govern Hungarians and us Romanians. Jews were emancipated in 1867, but by 1873 they had already become scapegoats for the economic crisis. In 1883, an anti-Semitic party under the leadership of Institut was founded. The party demanded the elimination of Jewish political and economic and social power and defined Hungarian identity in racial terms and accepted only Magyars of the Hungarian race. Support for the party increased because of the anti-Semitic agitation in connection to the ritual blood libel in Tisza-Eszlár in 1882-1883, where some Jews were accused of killing a young Hungarian girl in the neighboring Szabolcs county. The trial was widely discussed in Szatmár County, and a debate on the Jewish question followed. One stance in the debate in 1882 in Szatmár centered on the ethnicist and more exclusivist Hungarian point of view that stressed Jewish difference and denied assimilation as a solution. One Hungarian intellectual leader warned that Jews were increasingly buying land, claiming here, I quote, "Here lies the danger for the Hungarian society," end of quote, because, quote, "they will not have the same patriotic feelings," end of quote, "as ethnic Hungarians." Furthermore, he wrote, quote, "All commerce are in Jewish hands, and shopping without Jews does not make much sense," end of quote. In response to the charge that Jews were buying land from ethnic Hungarian, one Jew replied that other nationalities posed a much greater threat than the Jews, as the, I quote, "Valachians," which was the pejorative form of Romanians, "are dreaming about Deco Romania," end of quote. He remarked, moreover, that it, quote, "This is not just a different society, but represents the aspiration of a county to the east," so he meant the Romanian kingdom. He thus implied that even if Jews constituted a separate community, they were not least irredentist, like the Romanians, who aimed at dissolution of Austria-Hungary by integrating Transylvania into Romania. Furthermore, he advised the Hungarian authorities and society to apply a forced Magyarizing against the Romanians and not against the Jews, who were voluntarily Magyarizing. This means that the Romanian Jewish leaders accused each other of being threat to the Hungarians. A second stance in this debate was centered on the inclusivist Magyar point of view, which argued that the authorities and society should and could solve the Jewish question through assimilation. One Magyar argued Jews to Magyarize because, quote, "Jews here, with a few exceptions, are not Magyars," end of quote. The author also demanded a boycott of Jewish shops until they had Magyarized, I quote, "names, language, and emotions, and embraced the Magyar nation," end of quote. He suggested that assimilation should be encouraged by introducing civil marriage. Another Magyar advised Magyars to learn from the Jews because, quote, "If Jews are only interested in getting richer for themselves, we should do the same by establishing cooperatives in every village and city with a compulsory share of Magyar trade," end of quote. Furthermore, he argued that the Magyars offered Jews a homeland in exchange for their willingness to Magyarize. Some Jews themselves were critical to the assimilation, and one Orthodox Jew argued that against the assimilation of Jews in the economic field because he believed that it would only increase anti-Semitism. Magyarizing should be resisted, I quote, "The ruling nation Magyars will distance itself from the whole Jewish race. The introduction of civil marriage would not make any difference," quote, The reformed Jew will make geschäft out of it, end of quote. This critical stance was represented by Orthodox Jews who were afraid that the image of Jews would be associated with greed and that this would in turn fuel antisemitism. However, most Jews, especially progressive ones, were willing to assimilate, and as a sign of this, they Magyarized their names. One example is the famous sociologist Oskar Jászai, whose father, Dr. Ferenc Jakubowicz, requested to change his name to Jászai. Some Jews also received noble titles, like Solomon Meyer, one of the largest Jewish landowners in Szatmár. He became one of the leaders among the more progressive and Magyarizing Jews in the city of Szatmár-Németi. Members of the Károly noble family were the largest landowners and most powerful in Szatmár County. Count Károly expressed this typical attitude of Hungarian noblemen and declared that just as we keep the gypsies, quote, just as we keep the gypsies so that to play for us, we keep Jews to work instead of us, end of quote. Under István Károly's influence, the administrative center of the county remained in the city of Nagy Károly, Great Károly, despite the fact that several suggestions were made to transfer it to Szatmár-Németi. One of the arguments was that Szatmár-Németi was twice as large as Nagy Károly, and according to the influential Hungarian politician, the city was the true commercial and cultural center of the county. Nonetheless, the center remained in Nagy Károly, partly because the Károly family had its residence there and castle, and partly because Szatmár-Németi was regarded to be too much Jewish in outlook and was called the small Israel. Land was an important economic asset. In addition, it had a significant symbolic and political meaning for the nation, encapsulated by the slogan, "Those who own the land own the country." Thus, the more land the Magyars possessed in relation to the nationalities and the Jews, the more secure it was from a national point of view. At the turn of the century, reports came that Romanians had acquired lands from Magyars in Szatmár County. Leading Magyars demanded that the state should intervene, protect the Magyar land. The campaign was directed against Romanians, who were accused of receiving economic support from the Romanian kingdom, but also against Jews, and had an anti-Semitic dimension in which Jews were categorized as foreigners who bought land from the Hungarian race. Some intellectuals and political leaders demanded the Hungarian state to protect the Magyar race and suggested a colonization as a method. This was not implemented in Szatmár County, but applied elsewhere in non-Magyar dominated areas in the ethnic borderland. The state supported the acquisition of land for ethnic Hungarians through a bank called the Altruistic Bank. The anti-Semitic movement in dualist Hungary was sparked by economic crisis and ethnic prejudice, but lost its importance when Jews became instrumental in economic Magyarizing. Jews assimilated as Magyars because they received recognition and economic opportunities in return. In this process, Magyar politicians were less liable to question Hungarian Jewish economic institutions and companies as unpatriotic or to label them as foreign, with an important exception of land ownership, as I just mentioned. Thus, Jews became instrumental in economic Magyarizing, as Pécsics and others had suggested. With this inclusion of Jews in the Magyar category, the economy was Magyarized, not only in Szatmár County, but elsewhere. With the exception of the banks. They were small, but they were politically regarded as dangerous. The banks owned by the nationalities, like Romanian, Slovak, and Serbian banks. However, in relation to the Magyarizing of the nationality, this strategy failed because the forced assimilation had increased the ethnic consciousness of nationalities and motivated them to deepen their contacts with the external homeland, like the case with ethnic Romanians and their contacts with the Romanian kingdom. The inclusion of Jews as Magyars was thus conditioned of their usefulness in Magyarizing the nationality. After the First World War, when Hungary lost large parts of its territories, including the ethnic borderlands, the role of the Jews in the nationalizing process was played out. Jews were needed, and instead they were excluded from Hungarianization. If we go into interwar Romania, The category, so now I would draw some conclusions on my study of Satu-Mare in interwar Romania. The category of Magyars, which was defined in ethno-linguistic definition, was deliberately divided between Hungarians and Jews for the purpose of Romanization, according to the classical divide and rule strategy. Antisemitism was thus a manifestation of itself, but also part of the ethno-national conflict of the region. Jews were discriminated against within the Romanian land reform, regarding state subsidies to religious communities, regarding public sector employment, from which they were more or less totally excluded in the 1930s. Arnold Toynbee wrote in 1938 that Romanians were disappointed because I quote, all well-paid jobs are in the hands of the minorities. The minorities and the Jews were disappointed because they were, quote, being pushed out of jobs to which they have a professional claim for political reasons which ought not to come in. Despite efforts to Romanianize the borderlands, the relative share of Jews in the private sector increased, mainly because Romanian companies were not inclined to invest in the ethnic borderland because of the risk of a border revision. As you see, the cities near the Hungarian territory and had a large Hungarian population. The consequence was a radicalization in methods, including the revocal of Romanian citizenship for the Jews in 1938, and by introducing an ethnic quota system, and in late 1940 also an anti-Jewish legislation. These efforts created a system of exploitation as the Romanian administrators demanded more bribes to circumvent this kind of legislation. According to the Jewish memorial book of Szatmár, money was the key to open every door during the Romanian period. This system of exploitation continued during the Hungarian regime from 1940 to 1944. The anti-Jewish legislation in Hungary imposed quotas on the Jewish share in certain professions. But this legislation was never fully implemented because Jews held around 50% of all licenses in the city of Szatmár all the way up until they were deported, even though the legislation stipulated a maximum of 12%. Another important factor was that leading Jews who have devoted themselves for the Hungarian national cause during the Romanian period were exempted from the anti-Jewish legislation on the recommendations from the Hungarian prefect. Some of the Jews exempted were the wealthiest Jewish families, like the Prince family, and the head of family, Armin Prince, had been the leader of the Hungarian ethnic party during interwar Romania. This exception provided the Prince and other similar families with political connections in the Hungarian period and was very profitable for them in economic terms. However, the failure of anti-Jewish legislation and the large share of Jews in the economy, including visibility of rich Jewish families profiting during the war, increased the demands of radical solutions among the right-wing supporters. The Hungarian elite legitimized the deportation and nationalization of Jewish property as an economic salvation in the form of a national gift to the Hungarian public. So I come to my conclusions. In interwar Romania and Hungary, the anti-Jewish legislation which enabled the Romanian and the Hungarian to exploit the Jews in economic terms. Even though the official purpose of the anti-Jewish legislation was to decrease the Jewish share of the economy and increase the Hungarian and the Romanian respectively, the implementation was much more pragmatic because it provided the political leaders and administrators with economic benefits. In addition, each time a radical implementation had been tried, this had been backfired, like in 1938 in Romania and 1940 in Hungary. The leaders therefore learned that nationalization had to be balanced in order to maintain the level of production. This kind of exploiting anti-Semitism with a gradual implementation in Hungary, Romania, is well summarized by the regent Miklos Horthy, who wrote in 1940, I quote, "As regard the Jewish problems, I have been an anti-Semite through all my life. I consider it intolerable that here in Hungary, every factory, bank, large fortune, business, theater, press, commercial enterprise, etc., should be in the hand of the Jews. Since, however, one of the most important tasks of the government is to raise the living standard, it is impossible in a year or two to eliminate the Jews who have everything in their hands and replace them by incompetent, mostly unworthy, big-mounted elements, for we would become bankrupt. This requires a generation at least. The position of Jews in the ethnic Hungarian-Romanian borderland was thus based on a system where Jews were excluded from the public sector and squeezed into the private one. The efforts to Romanianize and to re-Hungarianize the private sector through legal quotas failed. Instead, it induced mechanism of exploitation and radicalization. Eventually, the only way to completely re-Hungarianize the local economy in Szatmár was the deportation of Jews. Nationalizing was a social process deciding the fate of the Jews in the ethnic borderland, which ranged from the inclusion as an instrument of majorization in the dualist period into the exclusion of Jews during the Romanization in the interwar Romania and with re-Hungarianization in Hungary during the Second War, and finally with the annihilation of Jews during or after the German occupation, but still this was the way to completely re-Hungarianize the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anders Blomqvist, for this interesting lecture. Following the suggestion of Daniel Brett, we will start first with Irina's Marin's lecture. She is concentrating on Raubwirtschaft and internal colonization, the Jewish question and land tenure in 1907 in Romania. Please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. One word of warning, I do speak very fast. If I am speaking too fast for you, shout and I will try to slow down. Okay. So this is basically Irina's Leave a Human project. This is a 3-year project that she's doing called Fear Across Borders. And what she's looking at is she's looking at the 1907 peasant uprising in Romania, which was on, essentially, the whole of the country went up, but it started on the border between Romania, the Russian Empire, Austrian-controlled Bukovina, Hungarian Transylvania, and what she's in, and in all of these places there are Romanian ethnic kin peasants, and what she's interested in is the responses of both the Romanian state, but also the Russian state, the Hungarians, and the Austrians to this revolt, and also finding out how, in a non-literate community, how does news spread? So she's very interested in sort of rumours. So, and obviously this is the kind of 1907 period, so you have things like 1905, you've got the Kishinev pogrom, but 1907 really marks the last great peasant revolt in Europe, apart from the artichoke revolt of the 1960s in France. But that's another story, which is just for rural studies people. Okay, so Romania in 1907. So Romania has gained independence in 1878. It had been the 2 provinces, if I can just point them out here and here. They've been united in 1859. Serfdom had been abolished in 1864. But what we've got is we've got a state which is undergoing rapid modernization. We've got an attempt at kind of state building. We have the attempt to try and create a modern state very, very fast. It produces very uneven, very lopsided development, but at the same time, it's a society which is profoundly rural. As the statistics say, it's 80% peasantry, but it's also ethnically homogenous. By and large, it is 92% ethnic Romanian, it is almost 92% Orthodox. So what we have is we have massive investment in state infrastructure. We've got a railway building program. We've got the attempt to develop an army, and so on and so forth. But all of these projects rely very, very heavily upon foreign capital. They, because the Romanian state is a rural state, it doesn't have the resources to actually, develop these projects itself. And at the same time, Romania has, as I said, 2/3 of the national product comes from agriculture. Now, as I've said, serfdom is abolished in 1864. What is significant about it is what we get what is described as neo-serfdom emerging. So yes, serfdom is abolished. Yes, the peasants get land, but they are tied to the land. They can't sell the land. You can't liquidate your property. You can't. So effectively, they exchange their kind of political bonds for economic bonds. Okay. And what we also have is that we have this land tenure system dominated by latifundia. We have massive absentee landlordism, as landlords essentially, as part of the modernization process, are moving to Bucharest and also moving abroad, moving to France and so on and so forth. And what we see emerging in the place of that absentee landlord system is what's called the Aryandash system of leaseholding. So, before we pick up on that, just to look at the place of Jews and the Jewish question in Romania in sort of 1907. So essentially, Jews make up just 4.5% of Romania's population. The population is larger in Moldavia than in Wallachia. But the emergence of the Romanian state goes hand in hand with kind of state, with increasing anti-Semitism by the state. So we have organic, and this goes back pre-independence, so we have the organic statutes of the 1830s, which classify Jews as foreigners. And then we have the Romanian Constitution of 1866, which says that, as it says there, citizenship can only be acquired in accordance with civil laws. Only foreigners of the Christian faith can acquire Romanian citizenship. So Jews cannot be Romanian citizens. Yeah. So what about the emancipation of the Jews? Well, the 1878 Treaty of Berlin stipulates that, yes, Romania should treat all its subjects as equal before the law and give them civil and political rights. The Romanians just ignore this. They basically go say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to have a kind of case-by-case naturalization process. And they invoke these kind of protectionist arguments, the idea that if the Jews have Romanian citizenship, they will become all-powerful and so on and so forth. So essentially what you have is three categories of Jewishness in Romania in this period. You have foreign Jews, that is, Jews whose citizenship is that of another state. So Habsburg Jews or German Jews who are in Romania. Okay? You have native Jews. This is the vast majority. This is Jewish population that is simply just has no citizenship, and this is the majority. And then you have a few who have been granted citizenship. Okay? And beyond this, we also have further laws against Jews. We have the 1881 law on foreigners, a law against peddling, a law of rural communes, all of which are aimed against Jews. So, to talk very briefly about the peasant uprising. So what we have is the Aryandash system. And the Aryandash system, I think it's useful to just try and explain. So as I've said, you've got massive absentee landlordism. So what are landlords doing? Well, they need their estates to be managed. So they run effectively, very pre-neoliberal, they run a competitive bidding process for their estates. So what happens is that if you are somebody who wants to manage an estate, you essentially put in a bid or you offer a certain return to the landlord for basically running this estate. And essentially the landowners use this as a competitive process. And there's always this upward bidding that essentially they're always taking the highest bid. Okay. But the point is that how do the Aryandash actually extract increasing returns? Well, what they do is they basically squeeze the peasants. And so they squeeze the peasants more and more and more and more and more, because every time they have to make more of a return. Okay. The other feature is that, for example, there is no incentive for investment in these states, because the leases are very short. They're kind of 3 years or things like this. And in some cases, the contracts will say, any investments you make in this estate belong to the landowner, not to the leaseholder. So what incentive is there for a leaseholder to invest in the estate? Okay? So basically, all of these costs, as I've said, are transferred onto the peasantry. And in 1907, it goes boom, and we get the peasant uprising, and it engulfs the whole country in a matter of weeks. So, what's the response of the state? Well, the response of the state is that actually the revolt was actually engineered from outside. There were outside agitators who had come in from Russia and had whipped up the peasants. This was a plot to destabilize Romania and things like this. This was also there's an alternative narrative. This was a liberal plot to destabilize the conservative government, but what went wrong was it went too quickly. And so they weren't ready to seize power. And so what do? Well, their immediate reaction is to do things like arrest any Russian exiles or emigres in Romania. So they arrest the Potemkin sailors who had taken refuge in Romania after the uproar, because they must be responsible for agitating the peasants. And students, they have a pathological fear of students because they hear that the students are the ones who are encouraging this, and so on and so forth. And then they start to reflect a little bit more about the peasant situation, and they basically say, well, the reason why the peasants revolted is because of the Aryandash system. And it's the Jewish Aryandash who are the problem here. Okay, these are the culprits. These are the people who are messing up our good Romanian peasants. So, is this actually true? And frankly, no, it isn't. All right. So let's just look at who the Aryandash were. All right. So Kranger, not the playwright Kranger, and no relation to him at all, as far as we know. He points out that basically over 50 hectares, almost 57% of that land is leased out. Okay. So that's almost over 3,000 leaseholders. Okay. Of those, almost 2,500 are ethnic Romanians. Another 30% of them are foreign citizens, and then another 14% are Jews. So it would appear that the vast majority of these exploitative Aryandash are not Jews. Okay? By province. So the one thing that is odd about this is that essentially we're not quite sure what either Leonescu or Kranger mean by foreigners or Jews. And so this is the thing that is somewhat confusing within this, okay? They don't specify. So we don't know if in the category of foreigners they're including Romanian Jews, or whether or not Jews is Romanian Jews, or whether or not foreigners are any foreigners, or Jews are foreign Jews. Yeah? But essentially, whichever way we look at it, the vast majority of leaseholders of Aryandash are ethnic Romanian. Okay? But both of them say that essentially, the larger estates are controlled by the foreign Aryandash. Okay. Now, what Irina is arguing, or what she wants to argue here, okay, is that basically it's not the fact that there are foreign Aryandash that are particularly exploitative, that they are inherently exploitative, or things like this, but that it's effectively the practices within the Aryandash system that lead to the peasant revolt. Okay. So, I won't read through the whole thing, but the key bit there is the italicized passage. Okay, so all these leaseholders, the Jew and the Romanians, were in cahoots with one another, refusing to sublease any land for food and grazing to the villagers so as to impoverish them. Oh yeah, this is another thing that comes out of the abolition of serfdom, the loss of common land as well. So the peasants no longer have access to common ground for grazing. Okay, all of these guys are, they're all in agreement with one another as to how to treat the peasant. The mayors legalized agricultural contracts without the peasants being present and without their consent. There were legal cases that showed that landowners forced their peasants to work on estates for a second year, having not paid them for their previous year's work. And then the gendarmes just come in and basically force the peasants to work. So essentially the peasantry has no leverage here whatsoever. The whole system, local legal system is against the peasants, the administrative system, the whole kind of economic system, everything is kind of against the peasants. Very little, again, to do with Jewishness. So is the system of leaseholding intrinsically bad? And Irina sort of points out that actually a system similar to this, to the leaseholding system, does exist in Hungary. And it's an important feature of the Hungarian agricultural system. But it takes place on a much smaller scale than in Romania, and the legal conditions are very, very different. Okay, so essentially, Hungarian landowners, we don't get this massive absentee landlordism. Okay, so we have very few pure leaseholds. But also, although large Jewish capital rents a lot of the states and so on and so forth, but what we do find is very long leases, and in some cases generational leaseholding. That when one generation dies, it goes to the next generation. So kind of 25 plus years. So there's an incentivization to modernize your estate and to invest in your estate and so on and so forth, which isn't there in Romania. Okay. So basically, to talk about this. As I said, short-term leases, but essentially the Aryanised system is about asset stripping, okay? I've pretty much said this already, sorry about this. The result is that they're not exploiting the land, they're exploiting the peasantry, and that's Raubwirtschaft. And there you see the peasants carrying the crown, which is one of the sort of images that comes forward. Okay, so I'm not going to butcher the German language, but I will stick to the English and say it's a plunder economy. Okay, so what we have is an extractive leasehold system. It's not just a byproduct of this rush to modernization. It's not because we need to create a surplus to invest in these state programs. We need to invest in these things to kind of modernize the state. It's actually embraced wholeheartedly by the Romanian landowners and state institutions. The landowners just want to make profit at all costs, personal profit at all costs. And they don't care who they are renting their property to. If you're a Jewish Arandash, fine. If your return is going to be the best return I'm going to get, I'm taking it. So anyway, so the point is that even when the landowners are getting the money, they're not investing it in their estates. They have no incentive to. Okay, so as we said, even Prime Minister Katarzino, with his 3 million francs income, cultivate their land without capital, without livestock, and without other implementations. So again, talking about the great estates. So that's from Kidderlane. Kidderlane is one of perhaps the best sources. His reports back to Berlin are very, very full and complete. There's a bit of a gap with the Hungarian reports and the Hungarian Interior Ministry, because the Hungarian Interior Ministry reports for Transylvania and so on and so forth were taken by the Romanian army in 1919, and nobody has seen them since. other than the Purges saw them in the 1950s. They're listed in the archives, but nobody's seen them. So we've kind of got a bit of a gap there in terms of what's being said. Okay, so one of the other things is that this kind of, later on in the interwar period, the liberal thinker Stefan Zeletin is asked why is the Romanian state treating its peasants so badly? So this is kind of, this is much later. And he says, well, look, you Westerners, you have your foreign colonies. You have your African colonies. We have no colonies. We only have our internal colonies. So we exploit them. And that's the view, that the peasantry are an internal colony to be exploited, right? So basically, I think, no, we've still got more to go. Okay. The other point about this is that we have what Irina calls heavily legislated lawlessness. The laws are basically applied very, very selectively. And this, again, is from Kidelen. And I do like this quote. He says, I'll never forget the explanation of a German citizen who'd obviously been working as who rented big estates here and become wealthy. I would love to go back to Germany, but I couldn't possibly live again in a country where I too would have to obey the law. That essentially, as an Aaron Dash, you've got the gendarme on your side, you don't have to do this, okay? So basically, the thing is that foreign leaseholders, you've got the double advantage. Because you're a foreign citizen, you don't come under sort of Romanian law, and if you do have any trouble, you just appeal to your consulate. You've got your diplomatic representatives, and you can get out of the country. Okay. So basically, this is the conclusion, the kind of paradox of Romania at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's got laws galore against domestic Jews. And it's constantly passing these laws against domestic Jews. And it blames Jews for the uprising, okay? It denounces Jews and foreign influence as the root of all evil and subverting everything and things like this. But basically, the practice is that they create a whole set of institutions and practices and things like this, which kind of give rise to predatory capitalists, and they're more than happy to welcome in Jews to do this. And they treat, essentially, as I've said, their own estates as colonies. Okay. So, as I say, they will, in colonial style, autochthonous capitalists rented properties in Romania and exploited the local population in a way in which they would never have been allowed to do in another country. I think this is, again, another significant point. If a lot, for example, the most notorious of the Alan Dash are the Fishers, who are Austrian Jews and things like this. And the argument is, well, they couldn't behave as they behave in Romania in Austria, okay? But they're allowed to do so by the Romanian elites because the Romanian elites don't want to manage their own estates. They want the money, and they basically they're happy to take the profit. And that's your lot.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this very vividly presented paper of Irina. And now we are coming to your own lecture about antisemitism, moderate politics and democratization on the political and socio-economic periphery, 1918 to 1947. Please.
Okay, hello again. So I would say something of an interloper in here is that basically I try to studiously avoid extremism, anti-Semitism and things like this. So this is kind of the periphery of anti-Semitism, okay? So a cause of many arguments between myself and Raul is the fact that I am kind of into mainstream politics and not extremists and things like this. And basically what I'm trying to do here is look at the interaction between anti-Semitic discourse in mainstream politics. How did that discourse function? The way in which one of the phenomena we see is anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic tropes being, oh, sorry. Okay, better? Right. Being deployed against non-Jews, okay? But what I want to look at is I want to look at the nature of the party system, okay? And I want to focus in on it. And I also want to try to look more broadly at European rural politics. You know, as far as I'm concerned, peasants are the way forward, and you know, we should be loving our peasants a lot more than we actually do. Okay, and what I'm very keen to do is I'm very keen to avoid exceptionalism. If there's one thing that annoys me more than anything else, well, many things annoy me, it is that, you know, when I hear, Romania is unique, Romania is a special case, you know, you've got to treat, you know, Romania is incomparable with anywhere else, but, you know, polls say exactly the same thing, and so on and so forth, and, you know, so I want to contextualize, all right? So, essentially, what kind of got me into this is, or interest in this theme, is this poster which I came across. Because what the hell is going on here? This is Partidul National Christian Party, an old right, anti-Semitic, nationalist party. And this would appear to be a kind of classic anti-Semitic poster from the interwar era. You know, you've got the kind of, you know, normal anti-Semitic tropes. But for a nationalist organization, it's bilingual. They're Romanian nationalists who are recruiting people bilingually, okay? And apparently, and I'm not a Russian speaker, but apparently the script is pre-revolutionary, I don't know, maybe a Russian-speaking thing, okay? But we also see, you know, the vote democracy, and it's kind of phonetically spelled as if it's a kind of it's a Yiddish accent saying it. So is this actually a kind of anti-democratic poster, despite the fact they're wanting people to vote for them? Vote for us in the election because we're against democracy. Okay? Right. Now the interesting thing is these four heads here, which are the heads of peasantists. And they're from the radical left of the peasant party. These are the guys who are the most socially and economically radical. Okay? They're not the conservative figures of the party, so they're very, very specifically featured. Okay? So is it perhaps an attack on peasantists using anti-Semitic tropes? And you know, this isn't just a one-off poster. You know, if you kind of look, you can find enough of these kind of posters which are kind of attacking these guys. So just to look at kind of, you know, Romanian politics and Romanian historiography, and this is the kind of classical sort of image of interwar Romanian politics, kind of lots of infighting and things like this. Now, frankly, you know, and I'm going to try and keep this bit brief because otherwise I'll just start ranting and things like this. Okay, but Romanian historiography on the interwar period basically is pretty much focuses on nationalism, ethnicity, you know, and extremism and things like this. Or there's a lot of sort of big man biographies, you know, biographies of Carol II and so on and so forth. Okay. There's very little about mainstream politics. You know, this can be captured in two ways. You know, the best electoral performance of the Iron Guard, which we keep on hearing about, 16%. Best performance of the agrarians, 80%. And yet we don't get 80% of the books on the interwar period being written about the agrarians, which I think is wrong. But obviously I'd like to write all 80% of those books myself and get very rich. But you know, the other joke is obviously, you know, that there are more books on Romanian eugenicists than there were Romanian eugenicists. There are kind of, you know, half a dozen of these guys. Okay, so there's very little analysis of the relationship between the peasantry and their political representatives. You know, they're talked about, you know, 78% of the population, but we don't see very much about this. And how does mainstream politics interact with anti-Semitism and the issue of opportunism? Okay, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to theoretically, we're using political science to deconstruct the Romanian party system and things like this, and to look at the place of anti-Semitism within this. Now, one of the problems we have is, with the peasant party, is the lack of material. Basically, we are, you know, one of the reasons why my PhD took so long was it was a case of demonstrating to people that there is no archive. And how do you know when you've demonstrated that something doesn't exist? How long do you have to keep on looking for it and not finding it before showing that it's not there? Okay. It's an oral tradition. It's also, there's some evidence from France that some rural politicians rejected literacy or rejected writing down things because they saw that as part of modernity. And this was a threat to the countryside. Okay. On the other hand, when I did go and talk to the successor party in Sibiu, and I went and saw them and sort of said, do you have an archive? They said, yes, we do. I said, great, can I have a look at it? No. All right. Why not? It's not here. Well, where is it? It's with our oldest party member. Well, where's he? He's in his village. Well, do you know when he'll be back? Nope. Can you get in touch with him? Nope. Anything else I need to know? He's not very friendly. So your archive is in the hands of an elderly, uncontactable peasant. Right, we're going to give up on that. So what we did find eventually was the Sherban archive, and this was the state in which I found it, and that's Professor Chupa there. The man's a blur. Okay. So this is Sherban. Okay. He's a very good example of what I would call political travelling in the interwar period. He switches parties a number of times. He's the godson of the Romanian Prime Minister, Alexandru Vaida-Voivod. Interestingly enough, he starts off as very hardcore into agrarian issues. He's mobilised as part of the Austro-Hungarian army in response to the 1907 peasant uprising. And he goes into these villages, sees the state of the villages, and kind of gets involved and is shocked and becomes interested. Joins the Romanian National Party. He becomes rector of the agricultural section in Cluj. He's a very skilled administrator. He's an internationally respected writer on agricultural issues. He's cited by Matrani and things like this, talking about sort of influence. Okay, when the National Peasant Party merges, he goes with them. He becomes the deputy agriculture minister in the government, but he's unable to progress any further. He kind of gets stymied. Okay, 1935. His godfather defects and splits from Penetze, and Sherban goes with him. Okay, he joins Frontul Românesc, this party, which is a nationalist party. He gets promoted. Okay, then in 1938, Vaida then joins the National Renaissance Front, and Sherban joins the government again, and he becomes a minister in the Giurgiu government and things like this. And that's actually him in his National Renaissance Front uniform there. The reason why we have his archive is that he died before the communists arrested him. So essentially, because he was kind of off the agenda of people to arrest, they didn't go down and kick the door and seize his documents. We have some stuff from the Securitate archive saying, well, we raided this person's house, we seized all their documents, we didn't find anything we could use against them, so we burnt it. So again, this is why we have kind of missing material. The other material we have is from a village called Berlestein on the border with Yugoslavia, and from Soroka up in Bessarabia. That's the kind of height of Berlestein. That's from their town website where they're trying to promote you to come to it. So as you can see, Berlestein is kind of not there. Okay, so 1918, post-1918, triple transition. It's a period of democratic transition, but it's not tabula rasa. Okay, but it's not like post-89 or post-Franco Spain and things like this. But what you've got, parties have a big problem. You know, in 1917, Bucharest is occupied. You've got the Russian Revolution. The government promises universal suffrage, promises land reform, and essentially then repents at leisure. So we've got the expansion of the franchise, we have the need to establish local organisations for previously excluded voters. Post-World War I, we've got a highly mobilised population, we've got land reform, but at the same time we have the triple crisis of the countryside, which I'll talk about a bit. We also have huge variations in literacy levels across the whole country. Okay, it varies from county to county, it varies between ethnic group to ethnic group. Okay. And Romania isn't unique in this sense. So basically, a question about politics in the countryside, okay, and too little thought is given to rurality and things like this. So we have the triple crisis. We have essentially declining economic power of the countryside, okay. We also have declining status of the countryside. So we see the sense of people moving out of the countryside to the town, and the sense that the countryside is under existential threat. For a lot of people in the countryside. And the response to and one of the other complaints is that we don't have adequate political representation during this period. Now, the other point to make is that often the countryside is seen as very, very static, is seen as very unstratified. One of the points I want to make is that cows matter to politics, in the sense that the nature of farming gives rise to different economic relations. So if you are a subsistence farmer, your economic relations are different than if you are an agricultural labourer, if you are a farmer who has to deal with the middleman, or you have to deal with agricultural context. And what this means is that because there's concentration in certain areas, some regions will have perhaps some types of farming lend themselves towards more right-wing or more left-wing economic relations. And so you see huge variations, different regions. And also within the village itself, you have the division between those who engage in market relations, those who have enough land to sell stuff, and those who are still at subsistence level. So party formation, how do these parties form? Okay, basically they try to expand on the cheap. Okay, they don't try to expand organically. They basically use merger as a way of expanding their parties. So countries unified. We need to expand into Bessarabia, we need to expand into here, we don't have any party organisation, what can we do? Well, we'll just recruit with the party that will join the party that sounds fairly similar, okay? These are tactical things, okay? So it means there's very little sort of ideological coherence, there's strong centrifugal forces. And the point is that these mergers aren't even fully wholehearted. So, in 1926, the Peasant Party merges. They still maintain parallel organisations in towns. They have two presidents. One for the Tenure, one for the Pete, because neither president agrees to give up power. So you've got these kind of constant sort of centrifugal forces, and you have very strong resistance to form. Okay, so essentially what I'm trying to argue is that despite the fact that the interwar period seems to be very, very ideological, ideology isn't what holds these parties together. They are what de Verger calls a cadre party. We have very weak structures, it's collections of notables. The one thing you will never find is a membership list, because in these parties, membership isn't important. Who you are is more important than how many you are, okay? You see extensive use of baptismal relations and familial relations. They're all related to one another. They're all married to one another. It's quite incestuous, and that's why they defect with one another, okay? Social status in the village often mirrors party status in the village. Okay. So this is a culture of, what I was just saying, a culture of defection. This is just a list very quickly of all the different defections within the parties. And you see, you've got right-wingers shooting off, you've got left-wingers shooting off, and things like this, okay? So, big question. In a non-ideological framework, how do you mobilize people? And in an oral and a visual society where you can't kind of write down huge texts for people, and where you've got a party organisation which is very informal, where power is based on prestige and things like this, how do you distribute power? So what we see is all parties relying upon the basic Weberian charisma to dominate politics and to mobilise supporters, okay? So what I want to pick up on here, and this is kind of my big point, okay, the unique skills of the leader. One of the main points of charisma is that your skills are unique. You have the things that nobody else has, and this enables you to lead and dominate. And how do you demonstrate that? And one of the main ways in which, for Weber, you demonstrate charisma is through the power of revelation. Okay, you are revealing what nobody else can see. Okay, I'm just going to skip through this, but essentially, you've got all of these kind of posters that are revealing, this is what is wrong. I'm revealing, what is why things are wrong, and this is why you should support me. Okay, but what I want to point out is that this revelationary type of discourse isn't just about revealing Jews behind everything. Okay, it takes a number of, it's a constant practice. So, for example, here, again from the old right, this is from Nikolai Jorga, basically saying that Iuliu Maniu, the leader of the Romania, he's actually Hungarian. This is the big reveal. He's kind of conning you. He's really kind of pro-Hungarian. And then this one's Vida Voivod. Whose head is he smoking? I don't know. I can't identify that head. Oh, right, okay. Well, there we go. He's, Vida is a Nazi and he's smoking, But the point with charisma and charismatic is that everybody is doing this. So there's almost a charismatic competition. Everybody's trying to reveal themselves one more than the other. I'm more, vote for me because I can reveal more things. And of course, the other thing with charisma is that you have to constantly demonstrate it. Okay? And if I can just, So the point is that, again, this kind of, sort of thing, and this is from the peasant party themselves. And again, you see here, peasants being on the yoke, and there's the figure, where you can see, pointing, again, the visual thing. All of these parties, because most of the electorate, or a large number of the electorate, is illiterate, they all have these symbols, and they're constantly reinforcing, vote for the, the Kuza government was Kuza guys were a straight line, others are a square, the agrarians are a circle, and things like this, and so on and so forth. Okay. So the problems that you have with this is that essentially, you've got the central feudal forces from all these mergers. You've got very strong resistance from the village elite to organizational reform. The other problem with charisma is that because charisma can't be transferred, you have successional issues. And you can't succeed, and so on and so forth, from your predecessor. And so this leads to organizational sclerosis. The only way you can get ahead is through defection. So, okay. Now, what I want to flag up here is that actually, just looking at the elite level doesn't give us the full picture. Paradoxically, because we have such weak organizations, we have a lot of gaps. There's a lot of space for local initiatives. And we see huge amounts of sort of local variation and local people doing their own thing. And this we also see in Poland and so on and so forth. Okay. So these guys are doing their own thing. Okay, so let's just look very quickly at these three cases, and I just want just to sort of try and wrap up. Okay, so let's look at Szatmár. In the 1920s, there is absolutely nothing in the archive that suggests that he is kind of going to veer to the right and start embracing anti-Semitic stuff. He's just constantly writing about agriculture. He's interested in fish farms and stuff like that. Then, after 1935, after the split, he's basically trying everything he can to get political traction. He's using nationalism. He's using anti-Semitism. He's got documents about, marching formations in the hope that that might appeal to people. Songs, the Vaida leadership cult. He's busy composing songs in honor of Vaida. Religious calendars with the party members. Each month, you get a new face of the party and things like this. Despite being a Romanian nationalist, he holds his party meetings in Chuk in Hungarian. This is a guy, you talked about the numerus flaccus and, this idea, he's really big on enforcing the numerus flaccus and getting Romanians promoted and about the foreigners and things like this. And then there's a discussion, there's a Saxon fascist who says, well, I enjoyed your meeting, but I couldn't understand it. It was all in Hungarian. You go, what's going on here? He's also, in one of the newspapers there's scrawled in the margin, there are 7 pharmacies in town. 5 of these are controlled by foreigners. But that's it. And I kind of think he was probably just looking for a talking point for his next meeting. I don't know. I mean, he sort of... So Berlichtet and the Banat. Right. Bearing in mind that we were... So when I got... I'd been looking for these documents for a very long time, and I finally got the Berlichtet stuff, and I was really, really pleased. Finally, I can get a sense of what peasants think. What do peasants think about the Great Depression? What do they think about the attacks on democracy? What do they think about World War II, rise of communism? They think nothing. Judging from their files, you would not know that the interwar period or World War II happened, because there's absolutely no mention of it whatsoever. They mention Vaida's defection, but only because the president goes off with them. Their primary concern is their brass band. This is the thing that they are most interested in. Are we recruiting enough people to the brass band? And the reason is actually, and this comes from Jan Słomka, is that in Poland, is that the brass band plays at every wedding, funeral, every public holiday and things like this. So if you control the brass band, you control public space, and that's what they're most interested in. Incidentally, talking about the yoke and things like this, and the idea of the peasant on the yoke, they do invoke the yoke, but they invoke the fanariate yoke, which is really bizarre because it's in. Yep, just wrapping up. Because the Banat never had any fanariates. So where they've picked this up, I've no idea. But yeah, they're basically interested in things like draining the pig field, sowing seeds, and things like this. Okay, but interestingly, it is dominated by the older generation, the village elite. There are tensions with the young generation. Oddly enough, despite being in the Banat, the ethnic membership does appear to be predominantly Romanian. However, how much of that is just them just saying they're Romanian or whatever, I don't know, because the last Hungarian census for the place gives it as being 80% Hungarian, and then the first Romanian census gives it as being 90% Romanian. So whether or not there's switching going on, I don't know. So Bessarabia and Soroca. So what we find here, which is, as I said, Bessarabia is right on the border between the Soviet Union. This is the region that has like the lowest levels of economic development, lowest levels of literacy, all these other things. We find bilingual record keeping. Whereas other people aren't keeping stuff, in the place you least expect they are. They recruit into them ethnic Russians, women, and Jews into the party. And, oddly enough, they do have stuff to say about the interwar politics, and they write a very angry letter to to the leadership denouncing the Codreanu Pact, and they say, how can you defend democracy by aligning with somebody who would attack democracy? Which, given that it's Soroca, is a fairly sophisticated analysis of democracy. Okay, so other cases, okay? Basically, it's pretty much the same across Europe. Again, national agrarian parties struggle in both Ireland and Poland with the same things. In France, there are no national agrarian parties, there are regional parties, some of which embrace fascism, but they all tend to fall back on revelation. Okay. After World War II, one thing that's very interesting, I just want to very briefly, very quickly talk about this after World War II in Poland. Okay. So essentially, World War II, huge damage. Agrarians are targeted both in Poland and Romania and elsewhere by everybody. 1944, Witos, who's been leading the party since about 1909, dies. Mikhail Wojciech comes back from Europe, from Britain, and there's a successional crisis. Now, one of the things that's very, very interesting, and this is in Mikhail Wojciech's book, and he's talking about a debate with the communists in the Sem. And he basically says to this communist deputy, your real name is Fischer, and you're from the Soviet Union. So even after the war, he's still, and everything that's gone on, people, they are still using this revelatory discourse that I can see that actually you're not really a true Pole, you're actually a Jewish Russian. Okay. So conclusions. Okay, the party system's highly volatile and fragmented. Parties are weak alliances. In France, they can't even agree to have a single party. They try, and basically 3 parties agree to it. Then one party kicks out its leader for agreeing to it. The second party then decides it doesn't want to be part of it, and so they never even make it to their first meeting. Okay. Basically, many actors just adopted whatever was seen as effective. They're just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, trying to achieve anything and everything simultaneously. Revelation is kind of a very key thing. But sort of anti-Semitism and this kind of revelation is quite normalized. It's not unusual for these guys to do this, okay? But the weakness of party organization means that local initiatives and responses to emerge which don't have any relation to national politics. Okay, and my final point would be this: interwar political life is far more variegated, far more diverse. There's far more going on than we have ever given it credit for, and we should kind of spend a little bit of time of looking at kind of what's going on down at the bottom and embrace our peasants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll continue now with Rory Yeomans, who is currently a research fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. Let's just briefly mention his last 2 publications. One appeared 2 years ago, Visions of Annihilation, the Ustasha regime and the cultural politics of fascism. And just in this year, he's the editor of the Utopia of Terror, Life and Death in Wartime Croatia. His lecture now will be dealing with destruction from below, workers, purges, and public opinion in Croatia's Aryanised economy. Rory, please.
Thank you very much. And just to reiterate, thank you very much for inviting me to the conference as well and accepting my presentation paper. I am the last speaker in the last panel today. It's like being back at school. You know, my grandmother's actually, she's part Danish and her surname is, she's from the Anderson clan, so I'm definitely going to change my surname to Anderson and then I'll probably be at the start of the conference in the future. So my presentation today is looking at the process of Aryanization in Croatia between 1941 and 1945. For those of you who don't really know, I don't want to spend too long on it, but so between 1941 and 1945, when the Germans invaded Yugoslavia, they split up the country and they created this new state called the Independent State of Croatia, which comprised Croatia and Bosnia. So they created this new state. And so it's really looking at this process of how the Aryanised parts of the economy and how workers kind of reacted to that, the kind of different ways that workers reacted to that as well. And whether some of that process was actually a process that was driven by below, it wasn't simply, you know, that they had some kind of plan to do it. And the other thing I say about the presentations, they've all been very articulate and very flowing and very smooth. My presentation is not like that. I don't actually have a script to work from. I have bullet points and I kind of talk extraneously and I'm kind of Mr. Tangent Man, so I go off in tangents and so on, so it's kind of good that we've got 25 minutes to do this. Okay, so the picture on the front there is a picture of a Srpska banka, which is a bank that was set up in the 19th century by the Serb minority in Croatia, and it was meant to be a cooperative bank for the Serbian minority, and it was kind of an expression of their growing cultural and economic confidence. And the picture is from 1941, and it's from, I think, April 1941, and the man at the top of the ladder is removing Srpska banka. He's just about to change it to Hrvatska banka because it's being nationalized, and that's what the picture shows. And I'll come back to that later. And this bank still exists. It's still called Hrvatska banka, and it's on Petrinjska in the shopping area of Zagreb. Okay, so just very quickly to tell you the main areas we're going to be going through. So I want to have a look at workers and the social revolution. So there's these two nationalist workers' syndicates, workers' trade unions. They become quite heavily involved in this so-called social revolution that the Ustasha movement, which runs Independent Croatia, wants to implement. And then I want to have a look at this kind of dual thing the Ustasha movement have, which is this idea of terror and mobility. So whilst they're really carrying out the economic destruction of one part of the population, to Croatian workers and white-collar workers, office workers, they're really trying to promote social mobility and giving them increased opportunities. And I want to have a look at the role that this confiscation of Serbian and Jewish property has in terms of consumer demand and consumer need, because what you find is this massive upsurge in demand for consumer goods, because there's suddenly lots of goods on the market that you would have had previously. Then I want to say something very quickly about factory life after Aryanization. So what is the impact when you suddenly decide to take all your Serbian and Jewish experts out of the economy? What impact does that have on ordinary working life? Then something about denunciations and resistance, because this is another area that's very, very complicated. It's not simple at all. And then looking at workers' relationships with factory managers and factory commissioners, because one of the things the Ustasha regime does in 1941 is it appoints commissioners to all the factories and all the businesses it takes over. So what's the relationship there between workers and commissioners and managers? And then looking at this, there's a whole phenomenon of worker leisure, where they create these leisure organizations, which is like Dopolavoro or Kraftwerk, Freude, and so they're meant to be there to get the support of workers. And I kind of think it's important to point out that in Croatia, most workers are members of the socialist and the left-wing unions, not because they're necessarily socialist or communist, but because those are just the unions they join. So I think 10% of workers before 1941 are members of these nationalist unions, and so the Ustasha movement is always very, very worried about workers, that there could be a source of rebellion and a source of uprising against the state. Okay, so just also to make the point that, so in 1939, Yugoslavia creates a semi-autonomous Croatian state called the Croatian Banovina, And even though I'm looking at Aryanization and confiscation and a corporate economy they create after 1941, actually before 1941, some of these processes are already in place. So the Croatian Banovina is a very nationalistic, semi-autonomous state. Kind of slightly similar to Slovakia, independent Slovakia in the early stages as well. And it creates lots of institutes for labor, social research, and economics. And many of these are kind of created in imitation of similar institutions in Germany. So, for example, Robert Ley's Institute of Labor, it creates basically a complete copy of that. And that kind of reflects the fact, I think, that the Ustasha movement and the radical right are kind of gaining more support amongst workers. It's still more marginal than people who are joining the socialist organizations, but they are kind of gaining in support as well. And one of the things that the Banovina authorities do from 1939 onwards, they do start purging the economy, and they do start purging particular groups from a section of the economy, particularly Serbs, because they argue that they're overrepresented and they're now in an autonomous Croatia and that they shouldn't have as much rights. But also very much what they call unconscious Croats. That's Croats who have a very strong Yugoslav identity because they feel that this isn't really in keeping with the new nationalist spirit in Croatia. So this isn't something which suddenly happens in 1941. It's part of a slightly longer process. And one of the key publications which kind of propagandizes this kind of soft corporatization, this soft nationalization of the economy is a paper called Hrvatski Radnik, which becomes increasingly, it's a nationalist, the nationalist workers paper, and it becomes increasingly anti-Semitic over the late 30s and early 1940s. And they have lots of stories about Croatian workers being exploited by Jewish factory owners. And it makes an explicit link between Serbs, say Serb owners of factories and businesses, and also Jewish owners of factory businesses. So it very much puts these two groups together. Okay, so this is just a couple of pictures of the April the 10th, 1941, which is the day that the independent state of Croatia is officially created. The picture on the right is a picture of right-wing students in Jelačić Square. There's a picture of Ban Jelačić on his horse, pointing his sword towards the east because Croatia is meant to be Western and it's meant to be European, and lots of people in trams and on the streets of Spain. And it was genuinely popular when the German army invaded Zagreb. If you look at the newsreels, everyone's out on the street throwing flowers and they're very happy about the whole thing. Not necessarily because they like Germans so much, but because they were kind of unhappy about being in Yugoslavia, so there was that aspect. And the map on the left is really an ethnic map which nationalists produced, the Ustasha regime produced in early 1942, I think, and it's basically the ethnic situation in Croatia in the 1930s, and the darker red the area is, the more Croatians that live there. And so as you can see, there's a lot of, even places where there's very little Croatians, next to it there's a big dark red area, and that kind of justifies the border of the new state, because you've got to have all Croatians living together in one state. Okay, so coming on to workers and the social revolution. So as I said, one of the big themes of the Ustasha movement, apart from their claim that they've created this national revolution, when they create this independent Croatia, they call it a national revolution. They also call it a social revolution. And there are these two very important syndicates in Croatia. One of them is called the Alliance of Croatian Private Employees, which represents white-collar workers, office workers, that kind of thing. And there's another one called the Croatian Workers' Alliance, which is very much to represent workers. And they have a series of meetings with, and they actually request meetings with the head of the state, a guy called Ante Pavelic, and his official title is a poglavnik, which is like a Führer or a Duce. They also request meetings with the Ministry of Social Care and the Ministry of National Economy, and they set out a series of demands for things that they want to happen. And they have these meetings very early in 1941, April and the beginning of May. So one thing they call for is the surveillance of capital among Jews and Serbs. So they're very anxious that Jews and Serbs are not moving money out of the Croatian economy and transferring it abroad. They also want factory and labour commissioners appointed to factories. They want the removal of citizen rights from people they call undesired elements, which is kind of understood very racially. They want improved, and there's other things they want that are more related to the social situation for workers. So they want improved living standards for Croatian workers, and they want this kind of workers' culture to be created, and they want education for workers to be very much promoted. And then there's also this phenomenon, this thing they want, which is state labor service. So everyone should do state labor service. Everyone should go and work in a camp for a couple of months, reconstructing buildings, working with peasants, bringing in the crops and so on. And they develop this real cult of work. And this is something which they share with the new state. So one of the slogans of the new state is that the person who isn't capable of working doesn't deserve to live. So that kind of gives you an indication of that they think work is absolutely essential to the survival of the state. And these demands basically become the economic program of the Ustashi regime from sort of the middle of May onwards. Okay, so as I mentioned before, there's this weird kind of dual process going on in the economy in Croatia in the early months of 1941. Between, on the one hand, this terror, which is kind of economic destruction of the Serbs and the Jews, and also offering something to ordinary Croatian workers as a compensation, as a way to legitimate their rule, and as a way to get workers' support. So in early 1941, they set up a ministry called the Ministry for National Economy, and it has two separate offices. It has an office called the Office for Economic Renewal, and another office called the State Directorate for Economic Regeneration. And they're involved in the confiscation of Jewish and Serbian property and the exclusion of Serbs and Jews from the national economy. So one of the first things that happens after the Ustashi regime comes to power is that there is mass sacking of Serbs and Jews from the private and the public sector. They make exceptions for certain people, but generally, if you're a Serb or a Jew, you are dismissed from the business. They also have a program of mass confiscation of businesses and properties. So Serbs and Jews are moved to ghettos. So for example, in Zagreb, Serbs and Jews tend to live in the north of the city and then move to the south to ghettos, and their properties are then nationalized or liquidated, and they're given to ordinary citizens, or state institutions or cooperatives move into them as well. They also have limits imposed on their savings and special taxes. So this is something that's very, very familiar from Nazi Germany, where Jews have to pay a special tax. Serbs and Jews have to pay a special tax as well. But they're kind of not as subtle as the Germans. So they will, for example, kidnap a bunch of Jewish citizens, and then their other Jewish citizens will have to pay a tax in order. So it's more like a ransom as much as anything else. And this differs from place to place. So in some cities, Serbs, for example, have a very high tax. So in Banja Luka, which is run by a guy who's just crazy, they have to pay a very, very high tax. In other places, the taxes aren't so high. And the other thing is because there's curfews, there's basically a tax on consumption. So Serbs and Jews can only go shopping at certain times of the day. And actually, they say to other Croatian citizens, don't go shopping between these hours, because this is when the Serbs and the Jews are going to be doing their shopping. Okay, and I mentioned before that they have this one of the things they're very keen on is state labor service, which all teenagers have to go and work in some labor camp somewhere and do building houses or renovating properties, this kind of thing. Well, Serbian and Jewish students are not allowed to do that. They're banned from doing that. The reason they say they can't do that is because they're lazy, they're bourgeois, they've lived a very comfortable life, so they wouldn't be capable of doing it, so they're banned from doing it. Actually, it's a very good way of kind of segregating them from the rest of the population as well. And then in June 1941, the Ustashi police in Zagreb have a big sweep, and they arrest about 165 Jewish teenagers from Zagreb, and they, in a place called Croatia called Grubišno Polje, which is a place with a very large Serbian population, they also arrest large numbers of Serbs, and particularly teenagers, and they send them to a camp called Judovno. And the official story is that it's a work camp where they will learn to kind of work like Croatians work, and they become problems in society. And actually, they're taken there to be killed. So it's a concentration camp, not a work camp. On the other hand, they have this whole policy. They want to promote full employment and social mobility, so give workers new opportunities. And if you think about it, if you remove lots of people from the economy, then there are more jobs for other people. So you can actually achieve full employment. That's the theory anyway. And so there's this whole encouragement of social mobility, that if you're a worker, you can do anything. You can go and work in a factory, but you can go and be an actor on radio. There's all sorts. You can actually run a business. So that's one of the things they try and sell to workers. You can be a commissioner of this factory, and you actually have lots of workers who apply to become commissioners of factories. And this also kind of coalesces with a period of rapid urbanization, because they have purged so many people from the economy. Lots of people come from the countryside in search of work, and they have a very disastrous harvest in 1941 as well. So that brings lots of more people into the city as well. And of course, you suddenly have all these empty properties, so you have lots of people scrambling to buy these properties as well. And as I said, this creates a massive level of consumer demand. And it also creates something called wild consumption, which is when people just arbitrarily just move into apartments, or they take over businesses. They squat, basically, in these businesses. And the Stasi regime get very angry about this, and they introduce basically, you can be arrested, and theoretically you can be executed if you move into property, or you act economically in a very, very independent way. Okay, so just very, very quickly looking at the features of what they call it a national economy or a people's economy. And again, I think this is very much kind of reflecting their idea that this is an organic society, organic economy, where you have these three classes of people. You have peasants, you have workers, and you have intellectuals. And it's very, very kind of close to the German idea of the Volks economy as well. And the picture on the right is a picture of, it's a Workers' Day march from 1942, and it's a picture of the three classes in Croatia. So you've got the peasant with the corn sheaf, you've got the worker with the hammer or sickle or whatever, and you've got the intellectual wearing the trilby, because that's what you wear. If you're an intellectual, you wear a trilby. So just very, very quickly, so one of their big ideas is economic autarky, that the Croatian economy should be independent. Now, Croatia is paying 110% of its GDP to Germany in occupation fees, so it kind of doesn't really work as an independent economy. But this is one of their ideas, that, you know, they were, because they're at war with Western Europe, they can't be reliant on trade with Western Europe or America or Britain, so they're going to be far more economically autarkic. And this kind of finds its way into culture, so they want to create a nationally autarkic culture as well. So they appoint commissioners, labour commissioners, because they're meant to look after workers and make sure that the workers are being treated properly, and also factory commissioners who run these factories which have been confiscated from these minority populations. Another big thing for them is this idea of transparent fixed prices. So every good that's sold in the shop has a maximum price, and you can't sell over that maximum price, and the price has to be displayed in the shop window. And if you go over that price, you can be arrested, and theoretically you can be executed, because selling prices at a different price is profiteering and it's economic wrecking, and that carries a death penalty. And likewise, they have minimum wages for workers, so you can't pay workers below a certain level either. And they also, this whole idea that these syndicates said, well, you need to set up workers' culture and workers' economic system, so they create workers' banks, and they have this big house building project for workers, and they also set up these technical colleges for workers, because their idea is that this is going to be a state of workers, and in the future, the workers will be running the state, so they need to be educated. And the other thing that's very, very big from this idea of ethical consumption, that you should only buy as much as you need, so there are strict limits, there's strict rationing, but you should only buy from Croatian shops, and you should only buy sort of things which are morally sound as well. So it's, some of the stuff they do, you think actually that's kind of quite contemporary. We're always being told to ethically consume in a completely different way, but some of their ideas, it's quite interesting that some of the things they resonate with the kind of things that people are meant to do now. Okay, I'm really sorry about this type print. When I did it last night, it looked really good on the screen. And then when I looked at it this morning, I thought it's completely unreadable. But never mind, it looks good, and that's the thing I think that you'll agree is important. So this is just, I'm going to read not all of it, but the first bit of it. It's about a tavern owner called Leonard Schneider, and he writes to the State Director for Economic Regeneration. He wants to basically take over somebody's flat. And he says, I'm asking for the directorate to issue me the apartment on Turg Kralia Tomislava, 101A, which has been confiscated. The owners of this apartment are Serbs, and they are Lazo and Joco Basic. The first is dead, and the second has been deported to Serbia. Okay, and I think that's kind of really indicative of the kind of letters that people are writing. And people know what's happened to the former owners, and actually they're not really that bothered because they need a flat. And he goes on in the letter to explain that he's got a small child, they're living in the basement of where this flat is, they're living on the basement level. It's very damp, his child's very ill, and he and his wife deserve the right, they're law citizens of the state. And at the end of the letter, he says, I'm going to sign a rental contract right away at a price of 1,300 kunas monthly. That's as much as an apartment like this costs in this part of Zagreb. So it's in a very nice part of Zagreb, an expensive part of Zagreb. And, so he's really kind of bartering with the organization. And then he says, I hope the directorate will be able to fulfill my request, and I thank you in advance and remain for the homeland prepared. And this is what you always had to say at the end of any letter. So Dom Spremny, even if you're a victim, you're a Jew or a Serb saying, don't deport me, don't send me to a camp, you always end it with a Dom Spremny, because that was kind of the language you had to use in order to negotiate your position in the state. Okay, so one of the things the regime does is the regime newspapers, the movement's ideological papers, is they create this impression, all these businesses are being taken over by Croatians, and they just create this impression that there's really a kind of economy of plenty. It's a really plentiful economic situation for ordinary Croats. So these are just some kind of indications of the kind of letters the kind of editorials they write. So the first one's from a paper called Hrvatska Krajina, which is in Banja Luka, and it's the paper of this Viktor Gutic, the guy who's crazy. And they're basically saying in this paper that, because all these people have taken over these companies from Serbs and Jews, they're going to be run in a much better way. They're going to be more efficient. So, it says Sakib Morankic and Company, well-known assistants to manufacturing experts, opened a business in Mile Budak Street in a premises which before was occupied by Jewish business Schnitzler. The restaurant belonged to Lazar Janjetovic, has been taken over by Josif Gergic and is supplied with all kinds of drinks and snacks. In such a way, in a short period of time, our Banja Luka will see a greater number of businesses, which along with the existing ones will be able to satisfy all the needs of consumers and citizens. And then the report below, it's not an editorial, it's by a party paper called Nova Hrvatska, is really just describing all these auctions that they had in 1941 of the goods of Serbs and Jews. So they say, this is a very, this is from 1942, so it's kind of a bit later. So it says, today a sale of Jewish assets began in the rooms of the Zagreb Trade Center through a public auction. As is well known, this sale is taking place under the orders of the mayor of the city of Zagreb, Ivan Werver, every working day until the end of the month. Citizens have shown great interest in this auction, and on the first day alone, several thousand people visited the trade center. Every imaginable item is being sold, especially individual items of home furnishing. The sale is taking place on the spot, and the buyer can take away the purchased items right away. It is not a rare occurrence for consumers loaded up with several items to take what they have purchased and then return. Many items have already been sold. So they kind of were, in the papers, they were always consciously encouraging people to buy companies at auctions, to buy goods, because you could get special offers and you could get good deals as well. And it's very hard to know how popular these sales were, but I suspect people did turn up for these auctions. Oops. Okay, so the last part of the presentation, looking at factory life. So what was the impact on factories after this process of Aryanization and the purging of particular workers from the factories and the businesses? So one thing that becomes very clear early on is there's a complete skill shortage. If you get rid of a lot of your experts because of their racial or their religious background, you suddenly have a shortage of skills. So they bring all these Croatian workers into these companies, and the commissioners and the other workers are complaining, these people don't know what they're doing. They're lazy, they don't want to work. And you also find that, where there are factories in regional areas, the Croatian workers who are coming into the factories in Zagreb, and then the manager says to them, oh, can you go and work in this factory in Sarajevo because we need some workers there. They say, no, I'm not going to do this. So they have a completely different attitude to the workers that are being removed, so that causes lots of problems. And at the same time, Croatian factories having to produce a very high level of goods for the German war effort, so they're being told you need to reach these deadlines, and the commissioners are saying we can't reach these deadlines because the workers just don't want to work. And this is one of the things that they do in 1941, the Ministry of National Economy, is they create this whole series of labor protection laws for workers. So if you're a Croatian worker, you can't be sacked, because if a Croatian worker is sacked, they're unemployed. Unemployment's a bad thing, okay? And so what you find is a lot of workers, or some workers, take the attitude, I can't be sacked, I'm unsackable, I can do whatever the hell I want, basically. And this is an editorial in a factory newspaper called Hrvatski Grafički Radnik. It's the graphical workers paper. And this is exactly what he's saying here. Yes, several accusations have reached the union that some members of the factory have misunderstood the official notice which protects workers from being dismissed from work. And on the basis of this notice, individuals thinking now that no one can do anything to them have in the course of retelling this story worsened the already bad situation in which this union momentarily finds itself in respect to the unemployed. So what they're basically saying is that people are slacking off work, they're not turning up, and they're just not doing the job properly because they think that they can't be sacked. Okay, so I think I should be given by 5 minutes. Yep, that's fine. So this is just two examples of the kind of different responses you get from workers. So the first example is from a guy called Oro Sacher, who's the commissioner for Euler and Kastner. It's a very famous department store in Zagreb, and I think they have them in Austria as well. And it was run by a couple, two men. One was Czech, and the other one was Jewish. I think Kastner was Jewish, and he was sent to Jasenovac concentration camp, and he died there, and his wife died there as well. And Oro Sacher is reporting back to the Ministry of National Economy on the attitude of workers, because one of the first things he does as a commissioner is he sacks all the Jewish and the Serbian workers, right? And he says, as a supervisory commissioner in which competency have only been with the enterprise for a very short period of time, it is understandably not possible to test the reliability of all the allegations for which individual employees have been denounced, because that would mean investigating the entire past of individuals. It would take a great deal of time, and the question would then be, would this investigation result in the objective and actual truth? With this in mind, I have warned some of those making denunciations to think about everything very carefully so that no one suffers an injustice, and above all, so that denunciations are not motivated by personal considerations. However, those making the accusations have stuck to them, have signed them, and have taken forward moral responsibility with respect to incrimination. Okay, so that kind of suggests that a lot of workers are denouncing and they really have no compunction. And in fact, in early 1941, they have so many denunciations that they actually, the Ministry of National Economy produces a notice saying, don't denounce someone unless you've got some proof of it, so that because they're getting such a high volume, and people are just using it as a reason to just get revenge against people they don't like, or someone who's been a bit mean to them or something, you know? And then the second one kind of tells a completely different side of the story, and it's a collective petition from workers of the Hygeia factory, which is a shoe factory in Zagreb, and they say, the undersigned factory workers plead for Willem Berger as an absolutely vital technical expert to be released from the Judovno concentration camp, because the future work of the factory is dependent on this, as is the survival of 18 of his factory workers. We emphasize to whoever it concerns that there is an urgent need for the release of Willem Berger so that work in the factory can carry on unhindered and our survival is assured. Okay, and that just kind of gives you an indication. Willem Berger was a Jewish worker, and he'd been sent to Jasenovac concentration camp, and or Judovno concentration camp, and they were trying to get him back again. And so just kind of to finish, because I know that I'm running out of time, so why does this actually matter? Why am I talking about this? Because it's kind of economic history, and it's not massively interesting for absolutely everybody. I mean, I think one of the reasons is because so there's still a lot of people alive who live through this system, and it's still a part of their everyday existence because, you know, people are still alive who've done that. It's just a big issue. And actually the Srpska banka, after the fall of communism in 1990, the families who owned Srpska banka tried to get the bank back, or they tried to get compensation. They never got compensation. They have a Facebook site now. They have 23 followers, and that gives you an indication of the kind of level of interest. And there was a proposal by the leader of the Serbian minority in Croatia that, you know, they should reopen Srpska banka, and it would be a good sign that Croatia was, you know, making efforts to improve the human rights situation for its Serbian minority, and that might encourage more refugees to come back, and that kind of never happened. So this is still a live issue, and if you go to Zagreb, to Petrinjska, that bank is still there. It's still Hrvatska banka, and that's replicated all over Zagreb and all over the former Yugoslavia, that there are thousands of buildings and businesses which don't belong to the people who own them, and they've never got them back. And I think the second reason is because I would argue that the Ustasha rule and the kind of economic system and the kind of terror they put in place had a big impact on what came afterwards in the communist era, because I agree with Jan Gross. Jan Gross's argument was that the fascist era and the era of corporate economic system really made people more accepting of the communist system that came in place as well. And, you know, this is something that you see very clearly in Croatia, that people became used to, the fact that you actually didn't own property, that someone could come and they could nationalize it, they could take it away from you. You could be arrested in the middle of the night, you know. The government controlled wages and prices, and people got very used to that kind of system, and it was something that was happening in the 1930s already. It wasn't something which suddenly happened in 1941. And so when the communist system came along, people didn't see it as such an incredibly awful thing to have, because they were so used to it before. So I think this stuff is still relevant, as I said. And I also just think, kind of in closing, and this isn't a very fashionable view, I think a lot of what happened in the 90s was as a result of unresolved history in the 1940s, and so I think it's very, very important to understand, because Croatian historiography always emphasized the fact that the people who were killed or who were destroyed economically, they died because they were Yugoslav patriots and they were conscious socialists. Most of the people who were victims from this system weren't socialists. In fact, they were very anti-socialist, a lot of them. They were business owners, or they were small business owners. And then the other kind of theme in Yugoslav historiography was that almost nobody was involved in this system. So you had a few people who were collaborators and quislings. It was carried out by the Germans, and most people, well, obviously that isn't the case. If you are confiscating and you are liquidating thousands and thousands of businesses, and the Stasi regime murdered 500,000 people, that can't be done by a few people. And what I found through my research, and it's made it much clearer than just looking at terrorists, is the number of people who were not ideological supporters of the regime. They were not fascists, they were not particularly anti-Semitic, but they were willing to take advantage, or they were very, very poor and very, very desperate. And so they became part of this whole system, whether they worked for the ministry or not. So, thank you.
Thanks, Rory. I would like to thank to all of you for having taken in account the 25 minutes per each. So we are really in very good time now. We have a full 40 minutes for lively discussion. And first one who would like to pose a question is Gregor.
Thank you. I very much liked all presentations, especially the last one by Rory, and I would like you a question. Could you elaborate more on the Germans? Did they play any role in the Aryanization of the Jewish property in Croatia? And what was exactly the role of the Germans in the Aryanization of the property in Croatia during this time?
Yeah, they did play. I mean, first of all, a lot of the businesses that were confiscated were given to the German army and the German occupation authorities. The German minority in Zagreb and other cities also played a big role. There was a real conflict, because the Croatian government, the Ustaša government, they wanted obviously all the properties. They either wanted to give them to their cronies and their supporters, or they wanted to give them to their cooperatives or these workers' syndicates, or a lot of the factories and the properties went to the Ustaša youth organization, because they saw them as very, very important as the people who'd run the state in the future. And there was a real kind of power struggle between what the German authorities wanted to do with these nationalized companies and nationalized properties and so on, and what the Croatian government wanted to do. And again, I think it's a very interesting point, because the traditional historiography on the Ustaša regime was that essentially it was a puppet regime, it was a satellite state. It really did what the Germans wanted it to do, and that isn't really what happened. There was a very big power struggle. But the other thing I would say is there are quite a few. So when the Ustaša regime came to power in 1941, one of the first things the German government did is it brought over this whole group of German advisors, people who had carried out the Aryanization of the economy in Nazi Germany, and they were very young and very enthusiastic and very zealous. And there's one thing that, and Gutzali actually mentioned in his book, and there's this one guy who's like a 26-year-old, and he says, and he's being sent to the Eastern Front, but he's really eager to go to the Eastern Front, because he says everything's worked so brilliantly in Croatia. I can't believe how much success we've had and how well it's worked. And it hasn't. It's been a complete disaster, but that's his view. He's a very young economist, and they do bring in, the Croatian government work with a lot of the experts who carried out the Aryanization and the liquidation of the Jewish economy in Germany. So there's a very kind of complex relationship between the two. But it is very important, the German contribution as well. And also the other thing I'd say, something I didn't mention, is that in relation to this, one of the things that the Ustaša government does in 1941, it decides to deport 200,000 members of the Serbian elite, so businessmen, priests, intellectuals, to Serbia. and they work with the German authorities. They have these German experts who've already been involved in the deportation of the Jews and so on already by that stage before the Holocaust, and they actually use the same language. So they're sent to resettlement camps, and they're being deported, and this whole phrase, undesired elements, that's a Nazi phrase. That's what the Nazis used for the Jews and for Poles and so on. So yeah, that's a very important element too of the whole Aryanization process.
Yes. Next questions by Raul, and then Anders, please.
Thank you for an interesting panel. I've got a few questions to Dan and a few to Rory. And then, I mean, before the questions, actually, if I can't ask Irina questions, but I could make...
can ask questions for Irina. I will try to answer them as best I can.
Nah.
So, yeah, go on. Try me.
Okay, just a suggestion. The quote from the 1866 Constitution, where you translated only foreigners of Christian faith can acquire Romanian citizenship. That's, I think, a way that she tried to translate it so that it makes sense in English. But I think the original, which says only foreigners of Christian faith can become Romanians, is very relevant, because it's this whole notion of whether Jews can or cannot become part of the nation. So I would suggest she sticks to the original language of the Constitution and puts it as can become Romanians rather than can acquire citizenship.
I'll pass that comment on to her.
Please do. Also, I think you're absolutely right that I think in the category of foreigners, many of those foreigners were Jews. They were part of this category that you were mentioned. Foreign citizens would include a number of Jews. So, yeah, but you made it clear. But when you were discussing whether they preferred or didn't prefer a foreign Arendaș, and if they preferred Jewish Arendaș, I think it made sense for them to prefer Jewish Arendaș. And that's actually a point I make myself, because they would fulfill the economic function without having any political power. So you would never, with a Romanian Arendaș, you could always risk at some point an attempt to take over the property, an attempt to sort of become from the leaseholder the actual owner of the property. You could never risk that with a Jew, because they wouldn't be in a position to exercise any kind of claims to the property themselves. They were both excluded from having property and from political power. So I think that they fulfill the function because of the lack of emancipation. Now to you. You mentioned anti-Semitism without Jews, but I think, could you tell us a bit anti-Semitism, against non-Jews. Who were those non-Jews towards which the anti-Semitism was directed? And for Rory, I mean, thank you for a fascinating presentation. I was wondering if you could say something about the percentage of Jews and Serbs in the trade unions before the Ustaša takeover, if you have any data about that, and also if you know anything about skilled and unskilled workers. I mean, were Jews and Serbs overrepresented among the skilled workers? Were they primarily unskilled workers? I'm talking about factories primarily, not other sectors of the economy. And also, in terms of, we kept talking in the conference about hierarchies and racialized hierarchies. And how did this play out in Croatia? What relationship were Jews and Serbs to each other, and in the view of the regime and in the ideal? And was the treatment different? Because I think it was.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Economically speaking, because
okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Regarding whether or not they prefer Jews because they don't have rights, the problem is that the statistics show that the vast majority of Arendaș are Romanians. So if they, why? I think that would, if the idea that the Arendaș are Jewish or they are foreign isn't supported by either Leonescu's data or Kranga's data.
They're already 3 times more than the percentage of the population. So then you said 4.5 Jews.
Just stop a moment, please, because the others doesn't listen.
I would say that the point is not in absolute terms, but if you look at it, there were 4.5 Jews in Romania at the time, according to the 1899 census, and you already have 15% Arendaș who are of Jewish. The 15% of the Arendaș are of Jewish origin. Now that's 3 times overrepresentation just by counting those identified as Jews. If you count the foreigners, then it goes to up to like 5-6 times the percentage of the population, and that can be seen as overrepresentation. So it's not a matter of course there are, I mean, in a country with 92% Romanians, of course in absolute numbers the Romanians are going to be the majority in pretty much any category you want, except attendance at the synagogue. But you know, I mean, the point is how many they are proportionally to the number of Jews in the, and that's where it's important by province as well, and that's where it's important, I think, in terms of relative to the size of the Jewish community, not necessarily, okay, the smaller than Romanians.
I think the point would be that because this data is problematic, it's hard, I think we have to be very careful with drawing trying to mine the data too hard, because how this is classified, neither of them actually say. And what distinctions they're doing and so on and so forth aren't said. And I don't know what their sources are. So I think beyond that, you would probably have to have a discussion with Irina, but that would be my point. About anti-Semitism and they really hate the peasant left. It's always the peasant left. It's never Manu. Manu is never a target. It's always it's always this kind of peasant left, the ones who are most in favour of, really radically altering the economy, who are most in favour of sort of radical peasant democracy, all of these sorts of things, which actually again transfers over to the new right, because when the Iron Guard go on their rampage, they're not trying to kill Manu. They kill Majaru, who we saw featured, and they try to kill Mihalaki. He just escapes by the skin of his teeth. Unian is already dead by then. I don't know if they go for Loop or not, but certainly this seems to be their major hate figures within the politics. That's who's always being singled out. So yeah.
Hi. Yeah. I was going to say I'd do the simple question first, but actually none of the questions are very simple. It's quite complicated, as you can imagine, because Yugoslavia is a very complicated area. So in terms of Jewish and Serbian membership of the unions, I mean, I think Serbian membership is so they're like 25% of the population of the independent state of Croatia, and their membership, I think, is definitely higher. I don't know how much higher, but that's a sense I get from the kind of membership rolls I've looked at. In terms of Jews, I think the Jewish population it's different. I think in places like Zagreb, where the population is Ashkenazi, it's very well integrated, it speaks Croatian and German. No, I think they generally tend to be small businessmen, tradesmen, that kind of thing, and also people that run department stores. I think when you're looking at places like Sarajevo and Bosnia, where the population is very strongly Sephardic, I think then yes, I think I don't know what the size of the what the size they would be in the unions, but there's a very strong, and in fact it's a very strongly working class population, and in fact the population in Bosnia is very, very poor, so they have all these Jewish self-help organizations and soup kitchens. It's incredibly poor, and actually they're among the first ones to be killed, rather than as well as the rich Jewish, the more affluent Jewish populations. And I think in terms of, for example, places like Zagreb, the level of experts who are Jewish or Serbian is very high. Because I think in the urban areas, the Serbian population, a lot of them are very poor. They're doing jobs as janitors and waiters and things. A lot of the people who are liquidated since these camps are murdered. But that's the sense I get. And again, I haven't done any statistical work on it yet. But the sense I get is that the number of experts who are Jewish and Serbian is very, very high. And I think that explains one reason why, when they decide to purge the factories and the shops and all these different businesses, they have a real problem, because their expertise isn't there. And in a way, it kind of almost proves their own propaganda, because actually they've said Jews and Serbs control the economy, and then they get rid of all these, and kind of the economy really has major, major problems, because it has massive skill shortages. And all the commissioners who run these businesses say, none of these workers know what they're doing. They're useless. Why have you sent us these people? They can't do it. And also a lot of the commissioners are just, because they're ordinary people, they're kind of ordinary workers. Like you get petitions from actors. There's one petition I found from a 21-year-old theatre actor who says, I want to run some really highly technical business, and it's just like, because I can't make enough money as an actor. And it's just like, and this is the kind of level of the sort of people they're getting in a lot of cases. In terms of racial hierarchies, that's really complicated. I would say, I was going to say at the start of this presentation, and I didn't, is that it's a very difficult subject looking at what happens to the Serbs, because there isn't really another example that I can think of that's similar to it in the Second World War. So after the Jews and the Roma and Sinti, they have the highest level of casualties during the Holocaust. But obviously it's not really part of the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is the destruction of the Jews, and the Poromos is the destruction of the Roma and the Sinti, and they don't really have a word for it. And Serbian nationalists, sometimes when they talk about the Holocaust, they talk about it as in the destruction of the Serbs, which it isn't really. So there's not really a word for it. And the Ustasha propaganda is very much that not just these two populations work together, they're economically exploiting the country and they're politically exploiting the country, but actually they also have a whole racial theory that the Serbs are basically a Jewish tribe, and that the Serbian royal family is actually Jewish, and and that whole Freemason thing's come in as well. And I would say for the first 3 or 4 months, actually, if you had to belong to one group and you wouldn't want to belong to either in this state, then you're probably better off being Jewish than Serbian. For the first 4 or 5 months. I think after that, it changes, and obviously, then the Holocaust is carried out in Croatia, and it's carried out very ruthlessly. Jews are already being arrested by them because they're sent to Yudovno in May 1941, and they don't come back. None of these teenagers come back again. But I think for the first 4 or 5 months, actually, in terms of the racial hierarchy, it's probably even worse to be a Serb in that terms, because they're just absolutely hated, and they're just, the kind of language they use against Serbs is much more aggressive, much more extreme. And I think one of the reasons, and again, it's very regional, it depends where you live. If you live in Banja Luka, where this Viktor Gucic guy is, he just basically, he stands up and gives a speech, and he says, we have economically destroyed the Serbs, now we're going to physically annihilate them. And he makes it very clear that's what he's going to do. So I think there's a difference on where you live. And I think the reason why the rhetoric is so much more extreme against the Serbs is because I think anti-Serbianism, or Serbophobia, whatever you want to call it, is very integral to a certain aspect of Croatian nationalism. It's something which is genuine. It's been there for a very, very long time. Whereas the anti-Semitism isn't. It's something which they basically take on in the late 1930s, this movement, and the radical right in Croatia, because the Nazis are doing it, and it's right things to do. But in terms of native roots, no, there just isn't. There's not a great deal of support for anti-Semitism. And actually, when the Gestapo do their own like Svodki or whatever, their own, own analysis of public opinion is very negative. But the Ustasha regime, they actually make Jews wear a big zhed for Zhidov on the side and then one on their back. And even the Gestapo is saying, you can't make them wear this many, because they're huge, they're like bibs or something, and they're saying you can't make them wear signs as big. So they go completely over the top. But in terms of popular support for anti-Semitism, no, and people actually, it's very unpopular, the rounding up of the Jews.
Can I follow up with a quick question? Policy of forced conversions.
Yep.
It's never applied to Jews, right?
No.
Okay.
No. There are a very few number of Jews who do. No, but it's Serbs that they should convert to Catholicism, and it's a forced policy. It's not a. Yeah. But no. But the one of the things they do in 1941 in Croatia is a lot of Jews apply. They have this honorary Aryan clause, which means if you can prove you've done something meritorious for Croatian nationalism or Croatian independence, you can get a dispensation from wearing the yellow star and having to live in ghettos and so on. So a lot of Jews send in petitions and they apply for that. And then they have this other thing that if you've been baptized before 1941 as a Catholic, you can get a dispensation. Actually, in the end, they liquidate them anyway. But the ones who are in the worst position, actually, are the Jews who've converted to Orthodox, who've married Serbian women and converted, because they're in an absolutely disastrous situation, absolutely disastrous, because they've got a double whammy against them. So, yeah.
Just a moment. First, Anders would like to ask Rory one question, and then.
I was thinking about the concept you were using. You said that it was Aryanization. And I would suggest, wasn't it more about Croatianization? in that term. So, because I mean, it's directed against both Jews and Serbs.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and it also connects to my other observation, which I find very interesting, which I agree full upon you, that if we label this a kind of nationalization, both things, I mean, under this period and the communist period, we can understand that the mechanisms were similar, even though there were different ideologies on what kind of...
Yeah, I mean, to answer your second question, that was kind of the point that Jan Gross was making, and the point that I'm making as well, is that, you know, the processes where you basically, private property meant nothing. You could have had a business that you'd had for 100 years in your family, and then someone come and say, sorry, this belongs to the state now, we're nationalizing it, we're liquidating it. And that was kind of part of economic life in the independent state of Croatia, and it became part of economic life in Yugoslavia. And actually, one thing that I found out that I didn't realize that they were doing this was in communist Yugoslavia in the first years after the state was founded, you know, people who were convicted of economic wrecking were executed, they were shot. And this is exactly like the independent state of Croatia, so that didn't change. The Aryanization thing, I agree with you. What it was when I submitted the paper, I put Aryanization, and I did change it in the presentation, and I thought, no, people are going to know that I've kind of changed, so I just kept it as it was. But you're right, I mean, they do talk about the Aryanization of society and you know, and this whole thing of Aryans, but it's very fake. Really what it's about is about creating this autarkic economy through, you know, economic destruction, and the two things are kind of very closely related. So on the one hand, you have a purified economy where you don't have Serbs and Jews, and then once you've done that, you can have this autarkic, independent economy. But you're right, it's not really about Aryanization, even though they use that language a little bit. It's more about Croatianization. Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
Question for Anders regarding the population of Szatmár, especially the fluctuation of population in Szatmár. So how many people came and left the city after every change, and in how far did this affect the local economy and local administration and daily life in the city?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Actually, after the First World War, some of the top what can you say, noblemen, Hungarian noblemen, and the very top landowning elite, some of them left, but quite a lot of them stayed. And what's interesting is that some of them, the first mayor of Satu-Mare in the interwar period, he had been a Magyar, I mean, even in a Magyarizing society in the dualist period. And this man, he succeeded to stay throughout the whole period, even in the Second World War, where he once again became Hungarian. So he, I mean, belonging to the top elite. So actually there was some movement, so people moving out, and also, of course, the large parts of the Romanian elite left the city in 1940. But remarkably, many remained, and important persons in the elite actually utilized their Greek Catholic background, becoming Romanians during the interwar period, and their linguistic knowledge in Hungarian to articulate that they were Hungarians. So there were differences, but if you look at, for example, what Dan was talking about, there was a difference in the composition of minority in different cities. It was more a result of changing way of conducting the census than that large differences migration. For example, with Satu-Mare in 1910, 95% were Hungarian speakers and something like this were Romanian. And then the first census in 1920 showed that there was 25% Romanians. But in this context, everyone who had a Greek Catholic origin were declaring themselves as Romanian, no matter if they spoke Romanian at all. So it was based on denominational background. And the Hungarians were split, so the Jews became a separate category. So, yeah.
Thank you. Please.
Well, I have a short question to Irina's presentation. Actually, I hope we can answer it somewhat. I'm very much interested in this construction of historical narratives of the far right and of fascism in interwar East Central Europe. And I'm wondering how much this historical legacy of the 1907 peasant revolt was utilized in the 1920s and 30s. Was it really used? Is there a place in the historical memory of the far right that this was some kind of Jewish plot as it was interpreted in the pre-war period? Thank you.
From what I know, this is not something that she's found. What we have found is that it is utilized by the communists in the 50s and again in 77. So in 1957, there's a whole series of oral testimonies where they go and they interview various peasants who claim to have taken part and talk about their motives and things like this. And this is one of the few kind of sources we have. But what she's doing is that you've got the contemporary police reports there from 1907, and she's marrying those to the oral testimonies, so that if what a peasant says he did in that particular district is mirrored by the contemporary report, then we kind of can take it at face value. We obviously accept that in 1957, there's a lot of political pressure and things like this. And then there's stuff that comes out in 77. There's work by various different sort of historians. As I said, they use sort of different archive material. But I've not seen anything, or I don't know if she's looked. I will pass on the suggestion that she ought to look, because I say I don't know, but yeah, it would be an interesting point to look at.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? We still have approximately 10 minutes, but if we are already a little bit exhausted, we can obviously pass to the closing remarks. And I would like the colleagues for the very interesting lectures. And we'll ask now for the closing remarks Eva Kovac and Raul Karstochea. We'll have now time until 2 o'clock, and then the farewell lunch will take place. Thank you.